Recently, I've been getting questions about the different types of psychology careers and which ones I feel people should kind of like go into depending on their career goals. And a couple of years back, I believe it was sometime in my first year of my program, I did a video on different ways to essentially become a therapist, like different pathways to follow, where I very briefly kind of ran through I forgot how many different types of programs it was, or like different career paths, but very briefly ran through different career paths and kind of what you have to do for each one. But since I've been getting this question more and more lately, I thought it would be helpful to do more in-depth videos. So I thought I would start a series on my channel where I compare clinical psychology to other psychology or psychology adjacent career paths or fields. I decided to start this series in hopes that it would kind of give you some starting points to help you figure out which career paths you want to follow and kind of which programs you might want to be looking into. And today we are starting with counseling psychology. I thought about starting with like clinical psych versus psychiatry, or like clinical psych PhD versus clinical psych PsyD. But I decided not to because one, I kind of assumed that like if you are someone who watches my channel regularly, then you are either already in a PhD program, are planning to go to a PhD program, or are considering a career path in therapy, but probably not med school, because if you were, watching me would kind of be irrelevant because I have nothing to do with med school. And then two, between clinical psych PhD and clinical psych PsyD programs, from my very basic understanding and research that I did prior to starting my program, the only kind of real difference between the two is the amount of research like you have to do in the programs. I could be wrong, but that's my very basic understanding of what makes them different, like in the biggest way. And I didn't think that you would want an entire video on that. But I could be wrong. I could be entirely wrong. So if you do want videos on psychiatry and clinical psych PsyD programs, let me know and I will do them. I just didn't think that that would be a really good way to start off this series, if that makes sense. So yeah, if you want videos on clinical psych versus psychiatry and or a clinical psych PhD versus clinical psych PsyD, let me know down in the comments. And while you're down there, it would be nice if you could subscribe to the channel and maybe even become a channel member, and like the video. Or not, entirely up to you. I'm just happy that you're here. Hi. So on to the topic at hand. But first, hey, hello, my name is Jojo and welcome back to my channel. Or if you're new here, welcome. Okay, so first things first, what is clinical psychology and what is counseling psychology? Both fields of psychology have their own divisions within the APA, with clinical being division 12 and counseling being division 17. And so I went to each of their respective websites and pulled the definitions for each directly from there. And I will be including the links to both websites and another source that I used to find the information for this video in the description. So yeah, according to the Society of Clinical Psychology, Division 12, the field of psychology involves research, teaching, and services relevant to the applications of principles, methods, and procedures for understanding, predicting, and alleviating intellectual, emotional, biological, psychological, social, and behavioral maladjustment, disability, and discomfort applied to a wide range of client populations. There were a lot of commas in that sentence. In theory, training, and practice, clinical psychology strives to recognize the importance of diversity and strives to understand the roles of gender, culture, ethnicity, race, sexual orientation, and other dimensions of diversity. So there it is. And according to the Society of Counseling Psychology, Division 17, counseling psychology is a generalist health service specialty in professional psychology that uses a broad range of cultural, culturally informed, oh my God, I can't read, culturally informed and culturally sensitive practices to help people improve their well-being, prevent and alleviate distress and maladjustment, resolve crises, and increase their ability to function better in their lives. It focuses specifically, but not exclusively, on normative lifespan development, with a particular emphasis on prevention and education, as well as amelioration. I should have practiced. Amelioration. I'm gonna hope I said that right. Addressing individuals as well as the systems or contexts in which they function. It has particular expertise in work and career issues. So, right now you might be thinking, well, in more or less words, that sounds basically the same. And you're absolutely right. Because the truth is that clinical psychology and counseling psychology are really more similar than they are different on the surface. So in terms of similarities, professionals in both the clinical psychology and counseling psychology fields are required to go through a very rigorous doctoral training program. They are both considered licensed psychologists once they have finished their postdoctoral training and pass the licensing exams. They are both held to the same legal and ethical standards. They can work in the same settings, whether that be schools, universities, hospitals, correctional facilities, etc. And they are both allowed to work independently, in private practice, or in group practice. So at the end of the day, each path will basically lead you to the same outcome. That's just really the fact of the matter. Where clinical psychology and counseling psychology differ the most, though, is really in the history of each field, which in turn means that they differ slightly in regard to their theoretical orientations and their practice. And so on to the differences. So first, I'm going to be talking about, just very briefly, the history of each field and kind of what they grew out of. So for clinical psych, really, clinical psychology grew out of the medical field, kind of going all the way back to Sigmund Freud and like his beginnings of psychoanalysis. Clinical psych has tried really hard over the years, over the decades, to be considered more of like a hard science because it wanted so badly to be aligned with the legitimacy of medicine. And that's just from like what I've learned about it in school, really. Clinical psych for a very long time, really, and to an extent still really wants to be considered like a hard science that is very scientifically backed and with like, you know, proven treatments and all of that. And so with that, traditionally, it has focused on like mental health disturbances or mental health illnesses and trying to treat those. Counter to that, counseling psychology as a field kind of grew out of, based on my research, grew out of a more like vocational concern, what is called vocational psychology. And so what that means basically is that there was a large focus on industrialization, efficiency, basically like how your well-being impacted how well you did your job. And so it really like boomed and grew as a field post World War II when veterans were returning and they required counseling and job training in order to re-enter the workforce. And so those are kind of like the histories of each field very briefly. And so because each field kind of has its own distinct history and how it came to be, naturally there are slight differences in how they work and who they work with. For clinical psychology, because it grew kind of out of this desire to be aligned with the medical field and be very like treatment focused, typically professionals in clinical psychology are more aligned with like psychoanalysis or cognitive behavioral therapies, other like more manualized treatments that have been proven to work through randomized control trials. And so extending from that, in terms of practice, when you are a practicing clinician in clinical psychology, you are more typically involved in like diagnosing of mental illnesses, assessment and treatment of those mental illnesses, particularly like more moderate to severe mental illness, psychopathology assessment. So those are things like personality assessments, what we call it, neuropsychological assessment, things of that nature. And all of that is because of this alignment with the medical field. Whereas because counseling psychology grew out of this need to help people become more efficient in their daily lives, professionals in counseling psychology are more aligned with more client-centered treatments and therapies, more humanistic, multicultural kind of approaches to therapy that have typically not been a part of clinical psychology but are becoming more a part of clinical psychology as the field attempts to diversify. So in that regard, clinical psychology is kind of playing catch up in a way. And so out of these more person-centered kind of approaches to therapy, typically in counseling psychology, as a practicing clinician, you will be focused more on kind of personal, interpersonal well-being of your clients, addressing more like stressors in their day-to-day life that may be impacting their ability to function either in their personal lives or at work, more along the terms of like self and like career focused skill building in terms of like what therapy might look like in order to improve their daily well-being. And so as far as like theoretical alignment and what practice might actually look like, that is kind of where each one falls. And then of course there is a lot of overlap. That's not like a set in stone difference. There's a lot of overlap there. Those are kind of just traditionally what practice might look like for each of those fields. Another way the fields might differ slightly is if you go more the academia route in your career, is what your research focuses on. And so with clinical psychologists, there might be more of a focus on kind of like actual diagnoses and treatment of those diagnoses, like medical like health impacts or outcomes of various diagnoses, brain functioning, things like that. And then counseling psychologists research might have more of a focus on like multicultural and social justice issues related to mental health and well-being. And naturally, again, there's going to be a lot of overlap here. Not saying that each of those is like cut and dry. That is what you research. Lots of clinical psych professionals do research that aligns with counseling psych and vice versa. I'm one of those people. And then just in terms of like the name of the profession, clinical psych versus counseling psych, I guess it could be said that like counseling psychologists are in fact more likely to work in like counseling settings, like counseling centers, in colleges and stuff, whereas clinical psychologists are more likely to work in like hospital settings or more like inpatient settings. Like I feel like that's what people think of when they think of each field, and so they kind of just automatically follow those routes once they're actually practicing clinicians. But know that like that's not necessarily true. Like you don't have to do one or the other just because you're a clinical psychologist or a counseling psychologist. Like you can do whatever you want. And so in addition to these kind of more general differences across the fields as a whole, individual programs are also likely to differ much more across universities, naturally because each institution is just different in its own right. And so be sure, if you're considering counseling psych and clinical psych, be sure to do your research on each program individually very thoroughly, and don't just assume that because multiple institutions have, you know, clinical psych programs or counseling psych programs that all of the programs will be the same and follow the same format or academic plan, because they more than likely won't. At the end of the day, many people apply to both clinical and counseling psych programs when they're applying to doctoral programs. It's honestly just really up to you to decide which path aligns most closely with what you're hoping to achieve or what your career goals are. Sorry, I thought I saw something flying on my balcony. Yeah, it's up to you to decide which path is better suited for what you're hoping to achieve in your career. And so yeah, with that being said, that's all for this video. Thank you for watching, especially if you made it all the way to the end. I truly appreciate it. I hope as the first video in this series that this was helpful. Let me know down in the comments which field of psychology you want me to compare to clinical psych next. Also be sure to subscribe and become a channel member if you haven't already, and if you would like to. Channel members get early access to every video and special access to a members only chat room where you can connect with other folks and ask questions, offer resources, ask for support or advice, and generally just talk and connect. And I also have some plans in the works for the future that will only be available to channel members, and so join the channel if you want to stay updated on what those plans are. The link to join the channel will be down in the description and also in the first pinned comment in the comment section. Okay, well, leave me a comment down below if you have any questions or suggestions for future videos. As always, like, share, and subscribe, and click that little notification bell so you don't miss my next upload. And I'll see you in my next one.